The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of the Rossi estate, casting long shadows across marble countertops that seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah had been working at the mansion for 3 months now, though it felt like 3 years. Time moved differently when you existed in the periphery of someone else's world, when you were the kind of person others looked through rather than at. She moved with practiced efficiency, her grey uniform immaculate despite the early hour. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut, emphasizing the exhaustion that lived in the hollows of her cheeks. The kitchen was her domain from 5 in the morning until noon, and she took pride in that small kingdom, even if no one noticed. The Rossi household operated on a strict schedule, and Sarah had memorized every detail. Marco Rossi's espresso had to be prepared at exactly 6:45. The temperature had to be precise. Too hot, and he'd reject it with a dismissive wave. Too cool, and it wasn't worth his time. His breakfast varied based on mood, a language she'd learned to read through subtle shifts in his expression as he reviewed the morning papers. Sarah had never been meant for this life. Her degree in business administration hung framed in her tiny apartment across town, gathering dust like everything else from her before. Before her father's medical bills decimated her savings, before her mother's death from cancer left her as sole provider for her younger sister, before everything fell apart and she took the first job that would pay cash under the table. No questions asked, no background check complications. She didn't think much about how she'd gotten the position at the Rossi estate. The agency that placed her didn't ask many questions either. They simply handed her an address, a uniform, and a payment schedule. She learned later, through careful listening to conversations she wasn't meant to hear, that Marco Rossi was a man whose name whispered through certain circles of Chicago with a mixture of respect and fear. But in the kitchen, he was just a man who needed his coffee at exactly 6:45. The espresso machine hissed as she steamed the milk, creating that perfect microfoam that she'd practiced 100 times. The routine was meditative. Heat the cup, extract the shot, pour with precision, swirl the foam so it created a thin leaf pattern on top. A small art form that no one would ever appreciate, performed daily for someone who barely acknowledged her existence. Sarah was setting the cup on the marble counter when she heard his voice. Deep, controlled, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to obedience. Marco Rossi stood in the doorway of the kitchen, still in his black silk robe, dark hair slightly disheveled from sleep. He was handsome in that dangerous way that made women's magazines and crime documentaries, sharp features, cold eyes that seemed to calculate everything they observed. "You're new," he said, and it wasn't a question. 3 months, Mr. Rossi, she replied, keeping her eyes on the counter. She'd learned this too. Never make sustained eye contact. It made men like this uncomfortable, suspicious, or worse. The last housekeeper stayed for 6 years. He moved into the kitchen, and Sarah could feel the shift in the room's energy, as if the air itself reorganized around his presence. What happened to her? She retired, Mr. Rossi. Did she? He reached for the espresso she'd prepared. You know my schedule. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation from a man who noticed everything, or so she'd heard Mrs. Chen, the house manager, whisper to one of the other staff members. Sarah nodded, still not meeting his gaze. He took a sip of the espresso, and she held her breath. In these moments of evaluation, these tiny windows where she was seen, the stakes felt impossibly high. This job was everything. The salary was enough to pay for her sister's tuition, to keep them from the edge of the abyss. Better than my last 3 espressos, he said finally. The temperature's correct. The extraction's clean. It was the closest thing to approval she'd ever received from him. She felt something warm unfurl in her chest, though she kept her expression neutral. Thank you, Mr. Rossi. He set the cup down and moved toward the refrigerator. I'm having company tonight. Prepare dinner for 6, something elegant but not ostentatious. And Sarah. He paused, and this time she did look up, startled by the use of her name. She hadn't remembered telling him it. "Make sure the flowers in the dining room are fresh." "Of course, Mr. Rossi." When he left, she released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. This was the reality of her existence now. She was invisible, but invisible could be safe. Invisible meant she could keep her head down, do her work, and survive. She didn't know then that everything was about to change. She didn't know that the dinner she was being asked to prepare would introduce people into his life who would notice her differently. She didn't know that visibility, once granted, couldn't easily be taken away again. For now, Sarah simply moved through the kitchen preparing lunch, a phantom in grey, content to remain unseen. The evening of the dinner party brought a controlled chaos to the Rossi estate that Sarah had never experienced before. Staff arrived to prepare the house, florists arranging exotic flowers, a specialized cleaning crew working in silent efficiency, caterers bringing elaborate equipment into the kitchen that made Sarah feel like an amateur in her own domain. She'd been demoted to assistant duties, which stung more than she wanted to admit. The head chef, a temperamental Italian man named Roberto, had relegated her to vegetable preparation and plating. It was humbling work, the kind that made her feel very aware of the gap between her education and her employment. But she performed each task perfectly anyway. Julienne cuts on the carrots, Brunoise on the celery, a careful hand with the microplane on the Parmigiano Reggiano. Precision was something she understood. Precision was something that couldn't be criticized. By 8 in the evening, the guests had begun arriving. Through the kitchen service window, Sarah caught glimpses of them, men in expensive suits, women in designer dresses, all moving through the Rossi home as though they owned it. Their laughter was loud and unguarded in a way that seemed calculated, performed rather than genuine. "Garnish on table 3, Roberto snapped, handing her a plate with a perfectly constructed risotto cake, topped with crispy sage and a quail egg. "Move quickly. Mr. Rossi doesn't tolerate slow service." Sarah took the plate and moved through the kitchen's hidden door, timing her entry into the dining room for a moment when she could blend into the background. This was an art form she'd mastered, becoming part of the furniture, necessary but invisible. She approached the table and began laying garnishes with the precision Roberto demanded. That was when she felt it, a shift in attention. Not directed at her exactly, but a weight of observation that made her hyper-aware of her movements. She didn't look up, continuing her work with studied concentration, but she felt it as clearly as if someone had touched her skin. "Who is that?" a woman's voice asked, sophisticated, amused. "She's not part of the usual rotation." "No idea," a man replied. "New staff, probably." Sarah finished her task and turned to leave, keeping her eyes down as protocol demanded. That was when her skirt caught on the corner of a chair, a stupid, clumsy accident that sent her stumbling forward. Her hand flew out to catch herself, and she knocked a water glass across the tablecloth. The room went quiet. In her panic, she finally looked up, and that was when her eyes met his. Marco Rossi sat at the head of the table, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite pass. Not anger. She'd expected anger, not indifference. She'd become accustomed to indifference. Something else. Something that made her breath catch. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, reaching for napkins to blot the spill. "I'll clean this immediately. It's fine," Marco said, his voice cutting through the chaos. His gaze didn't leave her face. Sarah, isn't it? The fact that he'd remembered her name, not just remembered it, but used it in front of his guests, sent a strange thrill through her that she immediately suppressed. "Yes, Mr. Rossi," she managed. "No harm done." He turned back to his guest, but something had shifted. She felt it as clearly as everyone else at the table felt it. She finished cleaning the spill with trembling hands, acutely aware that she was being watched, not just by Marco, though his attention was the most acute, but by several of his guests. By the time she retreated to the kitchen, her heart was racing for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. "You okay?" Roberto asked, noting her flushed face. Fine, she said quickly. Just embarrassed. But it wasn't embarrassment. It was something more complicated, something that began the moment Marco Rossi looked directly at her and saw her, really saw her, for the first time since she'd arrived at his home. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of service. She stayed in the kitchen, keeping to the work that didn't require her presence in the dining room. But she couldn't stop thinking about that moment. How his eyes had held hers, how her name had sounded in his voice, how for one instant the invisible girl in the grey uniform had become visible. Around midnight, after the guests had left and the kitchen had been cleaned to Roberto's exacting standards, Sarah was gathering her things to leave when Mrs. Chen, the house manager, found her. "Mr. Rossi wants to see you," Mrs. Chen said, her expression unreadable. "In his study. Now." Sarah's stomach dropped. The dinner party, the water glass. She was being fired. She tried to think if there was enough money in her account to cover rent next month, tried to calculate how quickly she could find another job. The walk to his study seemed impossibly long, each step taking her deeper into the private spaces of the Rossi home, away from the staff quarters and into the realm where Marco Rossi actually lived. He was behind his desk when she entered, reading something on his computer. He didn't look up immediately, letting her stand in uncomfortable silence for a moment before acknowledging her presence. "Close the door," he said. She did, her hand shaking slightly as she turned the knob. "The accident at dinner," he said, finally looking at her. "That was entirely not your fault. You were going to blame yourself, weren't you?" It was such an unexpected response that Sarah found herself telling the truth. "Yes, I shouldn't have let my skirt get caught. I should have been more careful. You should have been protected from a chair with a sharp corner in a dining room where you're working." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, anger, but not directed at her. "This is not a household where employees are criticized for accidents that result from poor design." Sarah blinked, trying to process this statement. Every other household she'd ever heard of blamed the employee for everything. "Furthermore," Marco continued, "I'd like you to take on additional responsibilities. Mrs. Chen will outline them tomorrow. You'll work directly with me on household matters rather than through the general rotation. Your salary will increase accordingly." She stared at him. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted its rudeness. But Marco didn't seem offended. If anything, he smiled slightly. A private smile, as though he appreciated the audacity of someone asking him to explain himself. "Because I think you deserve more than invisibility," he said simply, "and because I've noticed that you're very good at what you do. Attention to detail matters in this house." Sarah left his study floating, her mind churning with implications and questions. She didn't yet understand what was happening, or how a simple accident at a dinner party could transform her position in his home. But she understood that everything had changed. Her invisibility had been noted, observed, and deliberately stripped away, and she had no idea how to process what would come next. The weeks that followed Marco's decision to give Sarah additional responsibilities were transformative in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Her new role placed her in direct contact with him far more frequently. Morning briefings about household matters, consultations on everything from renovation decisions to event planning, even occasional conversations about his business ventures that she was clearly not supposed to understand, but which he explained anyway. "You're observant," he said during one of these impromptu lessons, as she reviewed his calendar to schedule maintenance on the estate. "You notice details others miss. That's valuable." It was the first time anyone in her adult life had suggested that her mind was worth something more than the labor her hands could provide. But beyond the shifting dynamics with Marco, something else had begun to change. Sarah started to see herself differently. The promotion came with a salary increase substantial enough that she moved her sister into a better apartment. With the extra money came access to things she'd forgotten about. A good haircut, New clothes that fit properly, time for self-care that wasn't purely functional. It started small. A stylist who cut away the mousy blonde and gave her shape and dimension. New glasses with a modern prescription, updated from an old pair she'd been wearing. Clothes that fit her frame instead of hanging formlessly. She began to see, in the mirror, the woman she'd been before everything fell apart. Not quite her, but close enough to remind her of that person's existence. She didn't do these things consciously for Marco. She did them for herself, for the part of her that had started to believe she might be worth something again. But she was aware of his reaction to these changes. She noticed the way he paused when she entered a room, the way his gaze lingered slightly longer than professional necessity dictated, the way conversations that started business-focused seemed to veer toward personal territory, her background, her education, her dreams for the future. "Why did you stop pursuing business?" he asked during one of their evening briefings. They were in the library, and she'd brought him documents related to a property acquisition. She'd caught his attention by suggesting an alternative valuation strategy, and he'd asked her to explain her reasoning. "Life happened," she said carefully. "That's not an answer. My father got sick. Medical bills. My mother died. Someone had to take care of my sister." She shrugged. The future became about survival instead of ambition. Marco set down the property documents and studied her with that intense focus that made her both uncomfortable and oddly seen. "But you're intelligent enough for it. You understand business instinctively. I've listened to you analyze situations. You think like someone trained in economics. I took some courses." She didn't want to talk about this. Discussing her abandoned dreams felt dangerous, like opening a door she'd carefully locked. "You could pursue it again, if you wanted to." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him. He was a man who seemed to make things happen through sheer force of will, not through cruelty, though she suspected he could be cruel if necessary, but through absolute certainty in what he wanted. "Why would you care?" she asked quietly. "Because," he said, and his voice took on a quality she hadn't heard before, something almost vulnerable beneath the authority. "I think you've spent so long being invisible that you've forgotten what you were meant to become, and it would be a waste." The conversation stayed with Sarah for days. It made her think about possibility in ways she'd trained herself not to. It made her wonder what came after survival. It made her dangerously consider that her life could contain more than just getting by. 3 months into her new position, Marco hosted another dinner party. This time, when she descended the grand staircase toward the dining room, it was not as a maid preparing to serve. She was attending as his guest, a calculated show of proximity that made his intentions unmistakably clear to everyone present. She wore a dress she'd selected carefully, not trying too hard, but not hiding anymore either. The kind of dress that made her feel like the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming simultaneously. Her hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She wore subtle makeup and the confidence of someone who'd finally remembered what it felt like to take up space. The room went quiet when she entered. Marco stood at the far end of the dining room, conversing with a business associate, and he looked up at exactly the moment she stepped through the doorway. His expression shifted, a flicker of something raw and immediate that he quickly controlled, but not before she saw it, not before everyone in the room saw it. The other guests began to whisper, confusion and curiosity replacing the comfortable indifference with which they'd treated her on previous occasions. Marco approached her, extended his hand, and the deliberate formality of the gesture made it clear. She was no longer invisible. She was here as someone his attention had designated as significant. "You look beautiful," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I felt brave today," she replied, and it was true. "You should feel brave every day." As he led her into the dining room, Sarah became aware of the narrative shifting around her. The maid who'd been invisible had somehow become someone worth noticing. The poor girl had transformed into the woman sitting beside the powerful man who controlled a significant portion of Chicago's underworld. She didn't yet understand the complexity of what he was doing, the statement he was making by bringing her into his world openly. She didn't understand that for a man like Marco Rossi, claiming someone's attention publicly was a form of protection, a way of drawing a circle and saying, "This person belongs to my sphere now. Any harm is harm against me." But she was beginning to understand that transformation wasn't just about external changes. It was about permission. Permission to stop hiding, to stop apologizing for taking up space, to believe that she might deserve more than the bare minimum. As the evening progressed and Marco made introductions that positioned her as someone of importance, Sarah felt the last pieces of her invisible self fall away. She was visible now, completely, undeniably visible, and there was no going back. 6 months after the dinner party, where Sarah had emerged from invisibility, Chicago's underworld was still adjusting to what Marco Rossi had declared. The poor maid was no longer peripheral. She was central. She'd become more than a presence in his household. She was a fixture at his business meetings, not as a servant, but as an advisor. Her observations about financial patterns and strategic vulnerabilities had proven invaluable. People who came to negotiate with Marco now had to contend with Sarah's presence, her sharp questions, her ability to see through elaborate lies to the necessity beneath them. But more significantly, to those who understood power's true language, Sarah's visibility next to Marco was a statement of irresistible commitment. Rivals had tested this initially. During a particularly tense meeting with a competing organization, someone had made a veiled threat, something calculated to sound like a joke but carrying unmistakable venom. "Must be nice having such a beautiful accessory," a man named Dimitri had said, gesturing toward where Sarah stood near the window. "I wonder how you'd feel if something happened to her." The shift in Marco's energy had been imperceptible to anyone untrained in reading violence. But Sarah felt it, a tightening in the room, as though gravity itself had shifted toward him. "If anything happened to her," Marco had said, his voice never raising in volume, but gaining a crystalline clarity that made everyone present reassess their tactical positions, "there would be no place on this continent where you could hide. Wherever your family is, whoever you love, it would all burn." He'd said it with the calm certainty of someone speaking about logistics, not emotion. And that was the moment Dimitri and everyone else present understood. This wasn't about possession or control. This was about existential commitment. Now, as Sarah prepared for another event, this time a gallery opening where one of Marco's real estate investments was being showcased, she found herself considering the strange trajectory of her life with something approaching amazement. The transformation had continued at a pace that sometimes felt overwhelming. She'd enrolled in online business courses, studying for a degree she'd abandoned years ago. Marco had offered to sponsor her education at a university, but she'd declined. There was something important about doing this herself, about reclaiming agency piece by piece. She was getting ready at the apartment she now shared with Marco, not yet fully her home, but gradually becoming one as she added small touches. Plants on the balcony, books organized on shelves, photos of her sister in frames throughout the space. The dress for tonight's event was a collaboration between Sarah and a designer Marco had commissioned specifically for her. It was the color of deep wine, fitted in ways that honored her body rather than hiding it. It was elegant without being ostentatious, powerful without being aggressive. It was, in short, exactly what she'd become, a woman who'd learned to take up space without apology. Marco came up behind her as she was arranging her hair, wrapping his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar over the past months. The possessiveness in the gesture was unmistakable, but so was the tenderness, the contradiction that defined their relationship. "You're ready," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm nervous," Sarah admitted. These events still made her anxious. The gallery opening was significant in Chicago's business circles. Important people would be there. People who'd known her when she was invisible and would see her now transformed, trying to understand the narrative shift. "You have nothing to be nervous about." Marco turned her to face him. "Do you know what you are now?" "What?" "Irresistible," he said simply. "To me, to anyone with half a brain who looks at you. You were always intelligent. You were always capable. You just weren't allowed to be visible before. I removed that restriction, but the transformation, that came from inside you, that's yours alone." It was true, and it was the thing Sarah had been learning these past months. The external transformation had been real, the new clothes, the education, the position in his world, but it was a mirror, not a creation. The real change was internal, a shift from believing she deserved nothing to believing she deserved everything. She looked at Marco, this man who operated in the shadows, who held people's loyalty through a mixture of fear and respect, who'd seen her when she was invisible and had decided, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, that she deserved visibility. "Why me?" she asked. It was a question she'd asked before, but somehow it never felt fully answered. "Because you remind me that transformation is possible," he said. "Because you went from apologizing for your existence to owning it completely. And because the moment you looked at me in that kitchen, 3 months into your employment, with the remnants of that water glass still being cleaned up, I understood that the life I'd been living was incomplete. You represented something I didn't know I wanted. Choice, something real, not a transaction or an alliance. You." Sarah kissed him then, and it was all the answer she needed. They'd built something that shouldn't have worked, a poor maid and a crime boss, a woman with everything to prove, and a man with nothing left to gain from traditional measures. But sometimes the best transformations came from impossible beginnings. By the time they arrived at the gallery, Sarah was no longer nervous. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who'd learned to own her visibility. Conversations that would have intimidated her months ago now flowed naturally. People who'd once looked through her now sought out her opinion, and Marco, watching from across the room as she engaged with a group of investors, allowed himself a rare smile. The transformation was complete. The poor maid had become irresistible, not because he'd made her so, but because she'd always had the capacity to be extraordinary. He'd just removed the weight of invisibility that had been crushing that potential. As Sarah caught his eye and smiled back, a smile that held recognition of what they'd built together, acknowledgement of the distance she'd traveled, Marco understood something essential. The most powerful transformations were never imposed from outside. They were simply revealed by someone willing to see beyond the surface and believe in what lay underneath. Sarah had been irresistible all along. She just needed someone to notice.